Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my first official video. Apart from the introduction video, obviously, um, it's 1 a.m. in the morning and I'm making this video just for you guys. So if you did watch the introduction video, you might be wondering, hey, what kind of book are we reading today? I'm very excited. Well, I'm excited too. So today we will be talking about this book, Jet Aircraft Simplified. I'm sorry, it's a little late. And this book was actually written very long time ago. It was written by Charles Edward Chappell in 1954. So it's more than 50 years ago. And that's a long time ago, but even though this book was written very long time ago, I recommend you guys to read this book because it has a lot of valuable information for you guys to acquire. Because this author lays out really difficult information in a very clear and easy manner. So when you can just read it once and you can have the basic idea of pretty much all the propulsion that you want to know. I've read this chapter about the pulse jet and I immediately got this basic idea of what pulse jet was and how it functions, and that's how I can make this video and tell you guys about the pulse jet. So yeah, let's get into it. So pulse jet actually have different names, and I don't know why, but I think engineers just like to call things differently and make it more complicated. But these are some of the names apart from pulse jet. It's also called the resonant jet, or the aero resonator, or the intermittent firing duct power plant. So those three names are the same thing as the pulse jet. So if someone says, hey, do you know about the resonant aero resonator? Then you can be like, yeah, I know that. That's the pulse jet. Yeah, I know that. You mean the pulse jet, huh? Yeah, I know it. So yeah, just wanted to let you know that there are different names to the pulse jet. So when you hear these other names, you can know that it's the pulse jet. So next thing we will go through is how the pulse jet looks like. And I have drawn this diagram, pretty much copied it from the book. And it looked like this. And this is a bad idea because the camera flips the image. Who would have thought? But it's alright, I'll explain this. Pretty much the air goes through the entering nozzle like a normal jet, and the zigzag is the valve. It's also called the shutter, depends on whatever you want to call it. So air goes through the valve, and as you can see, there's a extruding pipeline over here, and that is where the fuel goes into the combustion chamber, which is right here, and that's where the combustion happens. And what happens when when there is a combustion process? Yes, the fuel expands. The gas expands. And if the volume expands, where does all that volume have to go if it can't go through here? It has to go through here. And that's called the exiting nozzle, and that's where all the gases escape. And due to Newton's third law, to an action there is a opposite and equal magnitude of reaction. So if there's a high velocity of gases going this way, then there obviously has to be a movement this way, right? So yeah, if you didn't understand what the heck was going on, don't worry about it because I will definitely be going through the processes. In fact, I'll be going through right now. So there are 3 stages in a pulse jet. Number one is the recharging stage. In the restarting stage, there's one thing that has to be done, which is the airplane must be moving at a high velocity. If the airplane is moving at high velocity, then the atmosphere outside the jet has high pressure, positive pressure, while the jet pressure inside the jet has neutral pressure. So what happens if there's neutral pressure inside the jet and there's high pressure outside the jet? pressure moves from high pressure to low pressure. So obviously air goes into the jet through the valve. It moves through the valve and it goes inside the jet where the combustion happens. So that's number one. That's the recharging stage. What's number two? Well, if there is air going inside the jet, there has to be combustion. So combustion is when there is a pipe, as I showed you. There's a fuel going inside, and there's a igniter. And basically, the fuel is ignited with a mixture of air and fuel. And so that makes these fuel and gases and air like expand like crazy. And so with this increased volume and gases, again with this diagram, the valve closes, and I'll explain this. The valve closes, but so this is the only exit that they can go, so all the gas exhaust escapes this way. So that's second stage. But I'll explain why the valve closes. So valve is actually the only moving part in pulse jet, and it moves due to differences in pressure. And again, pressure moves from high pressure to low pressure. So what happens when there's a combustion happening inside the jet? Well, during the combustion process, when all these gases are expanding, the pressure is high. It's higher compared to the pressure outside the jet. So as we can see, high pressure to low pressure, it's trying to go out this way, but the valve can only open one way. So the valve closes, like the heart valves, they can only move one way, and when it's trying to go to the other way, it closes. So yeah, it tries to go this way, but it's closed, so you can only go this way. So number two, that's the combustion stage. And number three, so let's say all this it says expanded gas escapes. Well, at that point, the pressure inside the jet is in fact lower than the pressure outside the jet. So what happens? Pressure outside the jet is higher, so higher pressure to low pressure. So air from the outside comes into the jet. When it's coming in, the valve reopens, so the fresh air is put in, and then so this three process repeats all over again, and this is one cycle. And so you might be wondering if this pulse jet can create enough thrust to make an airplane move at a fast velocity. Well, it can, because this cycle happens at a very rapid rate. In fact, the first aircraft that the pulse jet was attached to was called the German V1. It was used in the World War II, but pretty much that pulse jet had a cycle of 50 cycles per second. So 50 cycles per second is about 3,000 cycles per minute. So that's a lot of cycles per minute. And obviously it seems, although it has these cycles, it's kind of continuous. But they don't call it continuous because it's technically not continuous. There's another jet that has a continuous combustion, and that's a completely different jet engine. So I drew this magnified pulse jet where the shutter or the valve is opened and the air is entering in this way. And I also drew this diagram where the air is entering here. Oh, it's kind of hard to show you, but as air is entering this way, it goes through these compressors, and just these are the fuels, igniter, and then the exhaust gas escapes this way. So although pulse jet does sound all good and fancy, it does have some downside to it. So the major downside is it has a very loud noise whenever it's operating. That's why the first aircraft that the pulse jet was attached to, which was called the German V1, had a nickname, which is called the buzz bomb. Yeah, it's called the buzz bomb because it's made like a buzzing sound, like a really not loud sound. Another downside to it is that it vibrates a lot. So obviously there's going to be a lot of energy loss through vibrating. And the author also talks about differences in propellers and jet engines in this chapter of pulse jet. I think the reason being is because he wanted to tell you why people would choose pulse jet over propeller, when in regular flight, propeller is actually more efficient than the pulse jet. In certain circumstances, you want to use pulse jet over propellers. But before that, he actually talks about this supersonic flight. So in supersonic flight, he says the air acts differently than when the aircraft is moving at a low velocity. So air acts differently at supersonic versus at regular low velocity flight. So in low velocity flight, there's obviously going to be some skin drag, and also some induced drag, but these drags have little effects on this aircraft. It will have effect, but not very much. But in supersonic flights, what happens to the air is the air is basically piled in front of the aircraft, and so aircraft have to have a greater power to actually push through these layers of air, because at a supersonic flight, air acts differently, and these airs are like layers, like waves, and you pretty much have to go through these waves. So as I was saying, yes, so the propeller in regular flight is more efficient than the jet engines. But the reason why you want to use these jet engines is when you're actually moving at higher speed and at a higher altitude. At a higher speed, because with propellers you can't go as nearly to the speed of sound, just because with the I feel like with the power of the engine, and like these drags, like you just can't. He doesn't really explain it deeply into it. He doesn't go deeply into why these propeller-powered aircraft can't reach the speed of sound, while these pulse jets can. But he just says that the propeller-powered aircraft can't, while the jet engine aircraft can. So if you want to move at a very fast velocity, then the pulse jet is the way to go. Also at the high altitude, because at high altitude, air is less denser than at sea level, so there's less air particles. So with propellers, you have to actually push these air particles away for you to go through the through the air. That's why I think the Wright brothers flew their airplane on a cold day, because on a cold day, the air is denser. Also, the engine has higher efficiency when the air is denser, because the propeller has more things to push on, so it can go through the air better. But on higher altitude, the air is less dense, so the propeller has less things to push on. But on the other hand, these jet-powered aircrafts can move at a faster rate. That didn't really explain it very well, but basically what happens is if the air is less dense, then the speed of sound is lower. So for example, let's say the speed of sound on sea level is A, then let's say like pretty high up, like 30,000, well, let's say like 100,000 feet above, then the speed of sound is like, let's say like a half of A or something like that. I'm just making these numbers up, so I'm not responsible for these numbers, but I'm just telling you that the higher the altitude, the lower the speed of sound. So what happens is if you have a jet engine aircraft, you can go at a speed of sound much easier. That's why if you want to have an aircraft that moves very fast and at a very high altitude, then you want to use a jet engine aircraft. So at the very end, he pretty much talks about where the pulse jet can be used, and what the speed range is, and what the advantages are, and what the disadvantages are. So I'm just going to tell you about these 4 things, and it'll be the end of the video. So the first thing was where it can be used. It can be used on missiles. It can also be used on helicopters. It can be used on target aircraft, and it can also be used on emergency auxiliary power plant. Not really sure what that is, but yeah, he said basically like these are the places where you can use pulse jets. Obviously you can use in different, applications, but these are like the main things where they can use pulse jets. And keep in mind that this book was written in 1954, so maybe people use pulse jets in many other different places. And also the speed range. He says the speed range maximum should be about 2,600 miles per hour. Well, technically, it can reach 2,600 miles per hour, but practically it should be about 1,500 miles per hour. So, I mean, that's pretty reasonable. He said the advantages to the pulse jet is simple design, inexpensive to manufacture, high speed, lightweight, and ease of operation. Okay, those things are all understandable. Okay, so what are the disadvantages then? The disadvantages are extremely high fuel consumption, obviously great vibration, and obviously loud noise. So yeah, that's all about the pulse jet. There are some other things that the author talks about, but I thought these were the most important things that he talked about in the pulse jet chapter. And I will be continuously reading another chapters, and I'll be introducing you to these chapters and knowledge. And so yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys later.